Preface to the paperback edition. Why is world history like an onion? Jared Diamond presents this book as a short history of human societies over roughly the last 13,000 years. Its central question is why history unfolded so differently on different continents. Conventional histories often begin with literate states and concentrate on Western Eurasia, but Diamond argues that the decisive causes lie much deeper, in the long prehistoric period before writing. By 3000 BC, some societies already possessed agriculture, cities, governments, metal tools, domestic animals, and writing, while others did not. Explaining those contrasts requires moving beyond immediate causes such as capitalism, science, guns, or epidemic disease, and asking why those advantages arose in some regions rather than others. Diamond compares historical explanation to peeling an onion. The visible modern world is only the outer layer, and understanding it requires uncovering earlier layers of geography, ecology, food production, population, technology, and political organization. Prologue, Yali's question. Diamond begins with a question posed to him in New Guinea by a local politician named Yali. Yali asked why white people had developed so much cargo, meaning manufactured goods and advanced technology, while New Guineans had comparatively little. Diamond treats this as a concise formulation of one of history's largest problems. Since the end of the last ice age, some peoples developed literate industrial societies with metal tools and centralized states. Others became farmers without writing, while still others remained hunter-gatherers using stone technologies. These differences later allowed some societies to conquer, displace, or exterminate others. Diamond rejects explanations based on supposed biological superiority. He argues that no persuasive evidence shows that the populations who acquired advanced technology were innately more intelligent. His own experience among New Guineans suggests that they must constantly exercise memory, observation, judgment, and practical skill to survive in demanding environments. Modern Europeans, by contrast, often survive despite poor practical judgment because institutions protect them. Differences in social outcomes, therefore, cannot simply be read backward as evidence of differences in human ability. The book's guiding sentence is that history followed different courses for different peoples because of differences among their environments, not because of biological differences among the peoples themselves. Diamond acknowledges that environmental explanations have a troubling history and can be mistaken for claims that human action is irrelevant. His argument is narrower. Geography shaped the plants and animals available for domestication, the ease with which crops and technologies could spread, the size and connectivity of populations, and exposure to infectious diseases. Those factors influence the opportunities and constraints confronting human societies without mechanically determining every event. Diamond distinguishes proximate causes from ultimate causes. At Cajamarca in 1532, a small Spanish force captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa because the Spaniards had steel weapons, armor, horses, guns, ocean crossing ships, writing, political organization, and epidemic diseases. Those are proximate explanations. The ultimate question is why those advantages existed in Eurasia rather than in the Americas. Diamond's proposed chain begins with differences in wild plants and animals, and in continental geography. Regions with more domesticable species developed food production earlier. Food production supported denser and more sedentary populations. Specialists, rulers, soldiers, writing, technology, and epidemic diseases derived from livestock. The orientation and barriers of continents then affected how quickly these innovations spread. The argument proceeds comparatively. Polynesia provides a natural experiment in which related peoples settled islands with different environments and developed different economies and political systems. Australia and New Guinea test why neighboring regions followed sharply different paths. East Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, Africa, and Japan provide further cases. Diamond's aim is not to glorify Europe. Many basic elements of European civilization arose elsewhere and were imported. Nor is he claiming that history can be reduced to a single factor. He is searching for broad patterns that explain why the distribution of power became so unequal. Diamond also addresses several objections in advance. An environmental explanation is not the same as saying that climate directly commands people to behave in one way. The relevant variables operate through chains of cause and effect and interact with cultural choices. Nor does explaining conquest justify it. Understanding how one people acquired weapons and germs does not make extermination morally acceptable. Diamond explicitly separates explanation from excuse and argues that abandoning racial explanations is itself morally important. He also stresses that the book focuses on differences among continents rather than every difference within them. It cannot explain why one European monarch defeated another, or why a particular inventor succeeded. Its scale is comparable to asking why mammals replaced dinosaurs rather than reconstructing every individual animal. The proposed answer must fit many independent cases, including conflicts in which Europeans were not involved. That comparative scope is intended to prevent the argument from becoming a disguised celebration of Western Europe. Part 1. From Eden to Cajamarca. The first part establishes the historical problem. It follows humanity from its evolutionary origins to the end of the Ice Age, examines how closely related Polynesian societies diverged in different environments, and then analyzes the encounter at Cajamarca to identify the immediate mechanisms of conquest. Chapter 1. Up to the starting line. Diamond chooses approximately 11,000 BC, near the end of the last ice age, as a starting line for comparing continental histories. By then, humans occupied most habitable regions, but the large inequalities visible in later history had not yet emerged in their mature form. The chapter therefore asks whether all continents began from roughly comparable positions and whether some populations had received a large head start. Human evolutionary history began in Africa. The ancestors of humans diverged from the ancestors of living apes millions of years ago. Early hominins remained confined to Africa until forms usually associated with Homo erectus expanded into Eurasia. Much later, anatomically modern humans appeared. Diamond emphasizes the period he calls the Great Leap Forward, when the archaeological record begins to show more varied tools, standardized weapons, ornaments, art, and rapid innovation. Whether this change arose from an anatomical alteration supporting modern language or from cultural developments, it greatly increased human adaptability. Modern humans spread from Africa into Eurasia and eventually replaced or absorbed earlier populations such as the Neanderthals. They reached Australia and New Guinea at least 40,000 years ago, which required crossing open water. Their arrival coincided with the disappearance of many large Australian animals. Diamond considers human hunting a plausible major cause, especially because those animals had not previously encountered people and may have lacked effective fear of them. The extinction deprived later Australians of potential candidates for domestication, although it is uncertain whether many of those species would actually have proved domesticable. The settlement of the Americas occurred much later. The conventional archaeological benchmark was the Clovis culture, whose distinctive stone points appear widely in North America near the end of the Ice Age. Humans entered through Beringia, the broad land connection that joined Siberia and Alaska when sea levels were lower, and then spread south as ice barriers opened. Diamond notes disputes over possible earlier sites, but stresses the extraordinary speed with which people occupied the continents once access became possible. The sudden appearance of hunters was followed by the extinction of mammoths, horses, camels, and many other large American mammals. Again, human hunting probably contributed, perhaps in combination with climate change. By 11,000 BC, humans inhabited Africa, Eurasia, Australia, New Guinea, and the Americas. Eurasia had some advantages in population size and the continuity of occupation, but no simple ranking of human capacities explains later outcomes. The decisive divergence occurred after the starting line, when different regions developed food production at different times and acquired unequal opportunities for diffusion. Diamond also cautions that ancient radiocarbon dates require calibration. The exact dates may change with improved methods, but the broad sequence remains: modern human expansion, continental settlement, large animal extinctions, and then the unequal rise of food-producing societies. The chapter also considers whether early humans received different starting advantages. Africa had the longest history of human occupation and the greatest genetic diversity. Eurasia had the largest land area and several early human populations. Australia and New Guinea were settled long before the Americas, yet later developed less political and technological complexity. A simple first arrival advantage therefore fails. The regions that had been occupied longest were not always those that later became most powerful. Diamond interprets the disappearance of Neanderthals and other earlier humans cautiously. Modern humans may have possessed better language, tools, or social networks, but the archaeological record does not reveal a single decisive weapon. What matters for the later comparison is that, by the end of the Ice Age, populations on every inhabited continent belonged to modern Homo sapiens. Subsequent divergence cannot plausibly be attributed to separate evolutionary species. The chapter's starting line is not perfectly level. Populations differed in numbers, environments, and accumulated knowledge. Yet, none possessed the complete combination of states, writing, steel weapons, and epidemic disease that would define later inequalities. The post-Ice Age history of food production is therefore necessary to explain how initial differences were amplified. Chapter 2. A Natural Experiment of History. Diamond turns to Polynesia because it offers something close to a controlled historical experiment. Polynesian people shared a relatively recent common ancestry, language family, technology, crops, and domestic animals. Yet they settled islands that differed greatly in climate, size, geology, isolation, terrain, and natural resources. Over a few thousand years, their societies diverged from small egalitarian communities to densely populated chiefdoms and proto-empires. The most dramatic contrast is between the Maori of New Zealand and the Moriori of the Chatham Islands, both descended from Polynesian settlers. The Chathams were cold, isolated, and unsuitable for the tropical crops brought by the settlers. The Moriori therefore returned to hunting and gathering, lived in small dispersed populations, developed little political hierarchy, and adopted a strong tradition of peaceful conflict resolution. Northern New Zealand supported agriculture, dense populations, specialized crafts, fortifications, and chronic warfare. In 1835, several hundred armed Maori invaded the Chathams, killed many Moriori, enslaved the survivors, and took their land. The outcome reflected differences produced by environment, not separate racial origins. Across Polynesia, warm islands supported tropical agriculture, while colder islands or poor atolls offered narrower food bases. Volcanic islands often had fertile soils, coral islands did not. Large islands could sustain more people and specialists, while fragmented terrain encouraged independent political units. Rich fisheries could support dense settlements, even where agriculture was limited. Isolation reduced exchange, while archipelagos with regular contact supported trade, warfare, and political expansion. Population size and density affected social complexity. Small, isolated communities could retain simple technologies and egalitarian organization. Larger populations produced chiefs, hereditary ranks, administrators, priests, craft specialists, and monumental architecture. Tonga developed an expansionist political system that projected power across distant islands. Hawaii's large, productive islands supported powerful chiefs, irrigation works, temples, and dense populations. Easter Island produced enormous stone statues despite its remote location and limited resources. The Polynesian evidence shows that descendants of one colonizing population developed strikingly different institutions when placed in different environments. It does not by itself prove that the same mechanisms explain continental history, because continents offered more species, metals, and time. But it demonstrates that environmental differences can produce large social differences without invoking innate differences among peoples. The next question is whether similar processes operated on a much larger scale. Chapter 3. Collision at Cajamarca. On November 16, 1532, Francisco Pizarro entered the Peruvian town of Cajamarca with 168 Spanish soldiers and captured Atahualpa, ruler of the Inca Empire, whose army numbered tens of thousands. Diamond uses the encounter to identify the immediate factors that allowed Europeans to conquer large Native American states. The Spaniards invited Atahualpa into the town square, concealed cavalry and infantry around it, and confronted him through the friar Vicente de Valverde. When Atahualpa rejected the friar's religious and political demands, the Spaniards launched a surprise attack. Guns, trumpets, cavalry, and steel weapons created panic in the tightly packed Inca procession. Spanish horsemen cut down people attempting to flee, while the Incas lacked weapons capable of penetrating Spanish armor. Pizarro's men seized Atahualpa and suffered almost no casualties. The emperor later offered a vast ransom of gold and silver, but the Spaniards executed him after receiving it. The imbalance was not simply a matter of surprise. In later battles, Inca armies understood Spanish tactics, yet were repeatedly defeated on favorable terrain by cavalry and steel. Horses gave the Spaniards speed, shock, height, and mobility. Steel swords and armor were much more effective than stone, bronze, or wooden weapons. Firearms were still slow and inaccurate. but their noise and unfamiliarity added psychological force. The Spaniards also possessed ocean-going ships that carried them across the Atlantic and maintained links with Europe. Disease was even more decisive at the continental level. Smallpox reached the Inca Empire before Pizarro and killed the Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir. The resulting civil war between Atahualpa and his brother Huascar weakened the state just as the Spaniards arrived. Similar epidemics killed large proportions of Native American populations, undermining resistance and social organization. Europeans carried diseases to which their own populations had acquired partial immunity through long exposure. The Americas had few comparable epidemic diseases to send in return. Political organization helped both sides, but the centralized Inca state created a vulnerability. By capturing Atahualpa, the Spaniards seized the top of an intact chain of command. They manipulated rival factions and recruited indigenous allies resentful of Inca rule. European writing gave Pizarro access to accumulated information about previous conquests, including Cortez's defeat of the Aztecs. Atahualpa had no comparable written accounts of Europeans and made decisions based on fragmentary oral reports. The Spaniards could draw on centuries of recorded navigation, warfare, geography, and statecraft. Cajamarca therefore illustrates guns, steel weapons, horses, epidemic germs, ships, centralized states, and writing. Yet it does not explain why these advantages belonged to Spain. The Incas had built an impressive empire, but they had no horses, no iron weapons, no alphabetic writing, and no experience with overseas invaders. The rest of the book turns from the proximate causes displayed at Cajamarca to the deeper geographic causes that distributed those advantages unequally. Diamond draws heavily on written Spanish accounts of the encounter, while recognizing that they were produced by victors with religious and political motives. Their descriptions nevertheless reveal the Spaniards' tactical plan and the shock created by cavalry and steel. The Spanish force also benefited from a tradition of warfare against other mounted, armored states. Many soldiers were experienced in European or Caribbean campaigns, while the Inca army had never confronted horses or firearms before the Civil War's final phase. Atahualpa's decisions reflected an information problem, rather than simple foolishness. The Inca Empire had no reason to imagine that a few foreign visitors represented a continent containing millions of people and the capacity to send repeated expeditions. The Spaniards, by contrast, knew that small forces had already overthrown American states and expected reinforcements from a growing colonial system. Writing made this asymmetry cumulative. Each European expedition could learn from earlier voyages, while information reaching the Incas was local, recent, and difficult to verify. The victory also depended on alliances. The Inca Empire had conquered many peoples recently and imposed labor and tribute. Spaniards recruited those enemies as guides, carriers, soldiers, and suppliers. Centralized empires can concentrate power, but they can also accumulate resentments and collapse rapidly when the center is captured. These complications do not replace Diamond's material factors. They explain how those factors operated in the specific political landscape of the Andes. Part 2. The Rise and Spread of Food Production. The second part examines the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. Diamond asks why food production arose independently in only a few regions, why it began earlier in some places, why some crops and animals spread rapidly, and why other societies remained hunter-gatherers until modern times. Chapter 4. Farmer Power. Food production altered the balance of power because an acre planted with selected crops or used for livestock could feed far more people than the same land exploited only for wild foods. Domestic plants concentrated edible calories, while livestock supplied meat, milk, fertilizer, fibers, leather, traction, and transport. Plow animals allowed farmers to cultivate heavier soils, and horses, camels, donkeys, and oxen moved people and goods. More food supported denser populations. Sedentary communities could store surpluses, raise more children, and maintain specialists who did not grow their own food. Rulers and officials collected taxes, soldiers trained full-time, priests organized ideology, and artisans produced weapons, tools, and writing materials. Stored food made political centralization and social stratification possible. Large populations also provided military manpower and replaced losses more easily. Domestic mammals contributed to conquest in two additional ways. Horses transformed transport and warfare. More consequentially, close contact with livestock produced epidemic diseases that evolved into human infections. Dense farming populations sustained diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and tuberculosis. After centuries of exposure, survivors passed on some genetic and acquired resistance. When those germs reach peoples without previous exposure, they cause catastrophic mortality. Food production was therefore not merely another technology. It generated the population, specialization, political organization, transport, military force, and germs behind later conquest. Diamond's argument is not that farmers were personally superior to hunter-gatherers. It is that societies possessing suitable domestic plants and animals could accumulate advantages unavailable to societies whose environments offered fewer candidates. Chapter 5. History's Haves and Have-Nots. Food production did not begin everywhere at once. Diamond distinguishes regions where crops and animals were domesticated independently, from regions that imported a ready-made package, and from regions where food production never arose before modern contact. Secure early centers include the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes and Amazonia, the eastern United States, and New Guinea, while the independence or exact sequence of development in parts of Africa remains less certain. The Fertile Crescent provides the earliest strong evidence for plant domestication, around 8500 BC, and for animal domestication soon afterward. China independently domesticated rice, millet, pigs, and other species. Mesoamerica produced maize, beans, squash, and turkeys. The Andes developed potatoes, quinoa, llamas, and alpacas. New Guinea cultivated indigenous root crops and bananas. The eastern United States domesticated local seed plants before more productive Mexican crops arrived. Other regions acquired founder crops and animals from neighbors. Farming reached Europe from Southwest Asia, although some plants were later domesticated locally. Egypt adopted Southwest Asian crops and livestock without a complete replacement of its population. In some areas, local hunter-gatherers adopted imported food production. In others, incoming farmers replaced or absorbed them. The mode of expansion depended on population density, technology, disease resistance, and ecological suitability. Archaeologists identify domestication through changes in plant and animal remains. Domestic grains may have larger seeds or non-shattering stalks. Domestic animals change in size, age distribution, and morphology. Radiocarbon dating helps trace where such changes first appeared and how they spread. The resulting map shows a world of early and late starters. Those differences initiated a long series of encounters between societies with dense farming populations and societies without them. The archaeological map is not a simple set of expanding circles. Crops can arrive without farmers, farmers can migrate with their languages and genes, and local populations can adopt only selected elements. Europe, for example, received a Southwest Asian package through a combination of colonization and adoption whose proportions varied by region. In Indonesia and parts of Africa, incoming food producers expanded more dramatically over hunter-gatherers. Identifying the process requires comparing plant remains, animal bones, pottery, tools, languages, and human ancestry. Diamond also emphasizes uncertainty. A claimed early date can be contaminated by younger or older material, while a domestic specimen may be difficult to distinguish from its wild ancestor. New discoveries can shift the recognized place or date of domestication. The robust conclusion is not a perfectly fixed list of centers, but the strong inequality in timing. A handful of regions acquired productive domesticates thousands of years before others. Chapter 6. To farm or not to farm. The transition to farming was not an obvious leap toward a better life. Early farmers often worked longer hours, ate narrower diets, suffered more infectious disease, and experienced greater inequality than hunter-gatherers. Food production emerged gradually through thousands of decisions about how much effort to devote to wild resources and how much to cultivated plants or managed animals. Diamond identifies several interacting pressures. Wild foods became less rewarding in some regions because climate change and human hunting reduced large game. At the same time, knowledge and technology for collecting, processing, and storing cereals improved. Population growth increased the need for predictable food supplies. while food production itself supported further population growth in a feedback loop. Once neighboring farmers became numerous, hunter-gatherers faced a choice between adopting farming, retreating to marginal land, or being displaced. The decision depended on local comparisons. Where wild foods remained abundant, as on rich coasts or in some forests, hunting and gathering could persist. Where domesticable species offered high returns and seasonal shortages favored storage, cultivation became more attractive. The first farmers did not foresee states, armies, or epidemic disease. They responded to immediate opportunities and pressures. Over time, however, food-producing populations expanded at the expense of hunter-gatherers, who survived mainly in deserts, Arctic regions, tropical forests, and other environments poorly suited to agriculture. 5 major factors pushed the balance toward food production. The decline of wild resources made gathering less rewarding. The increasing availability of domesticable plants made cultivation more rewarding. Technologies for harvesting, processing, and storage improved. Population and food production stimulated each other, because more food supported more people, while more people created pressure for more food. Finally, farmers' density allowed them to displace hunter-gatherers, so the decision was eventually imposed on groups that might otherwise have preferred their existing way of life. Population growth need not have begun as a conscious cause. Sedentary women could bear children at shorter intervals than mobile hunter-gatherers, who had to carry young children during moves. A small difference in birth interval, compounded over generations, could produce a large demographic advantage. Once agricultural villages surrounded a hunting territory, the remaining hunter-gatherers faced shrinking access to land and wild resources. The process also involved mixed economies. Early communities gathered wild cereals while cultivating a few plots, hunted while managing herds, and shifted back and forth as conditions changed. The sharp categories of farmer and hunter-gatherer often describe the endpoints rather than the transition. Food production prevailed not because every individual preferred it, but because its population dynamics and military consequences favored societies that adopted it. Chapter 7. How to make an almond. All crops descend from wild plants, but domesticated varieties often differ so greatly from their ancestors that the transformation appears mysterious. Wild almonds are bitter and poisonous. Wild maize bears little resemblance to a modern ear of corn, and many wild fruits are small or filled with seeds. Diamond explains domestication as a process of human selection, often unconscious at first. Gatherers naturally chose larger, sweeter, less bitter, more easily collected fruits and seeds. When people discarded seeds near camps or later planted them deliberately, they favored the offspring of selected plants. Mutations that were disadvantageous in the wild could be useful under cultivation. Wild cereals disperse their seeds by shattering, but farmers can harvest only stalks that retain their seeds, replanting those seeds selected for non-shattering varieties. Many wild seeds delayed germination through hard coats or chemical inhibition. Cultivation selected mutants that germinated quickly and predictably. Farmers also selected plants for different purposes. Fruits became fleshier, oil seeds richer, fibers longer, and seedless varieties more common. Squashes changed from containers with little edible flesh into food crops. Some plants were domesticated for roots, leaves, fibers, or oils rather than seeds. Selection for simultaneous ripening, reduced branching, larger edible parts, and loss of natural dispersal gradually created crops dependent on humans. Different crops were domesticated at different speeds. Annual cereals and pulses could evolve rapidly because they reproduced every year and displayed useful mutations clearly. Trees, such as olives and apples, required long waits before producing fruit, although grafting later accelerated the multiplication of desirable individuals. Some crops, including strawberries and nuts, remained close to wild forms for long periods. Ancient farmers knew their environments intimately and domesticated nearly all locally useful candidates long before modern genetics. The process resembled Darwinian evolution, except that human preferences replaced natural environmental pressures. Diamond notes that Darwin himself introduced artificial selection through examples of breeders and gardeners, before explaining natural selection. Crop domestication demonstrates how repeated selection, without any original master plan, can transform organisms and ultimately human societies. Plant domestication also followed a recognizable sequence. The earliest crops were often species that required little genetic change and could be propagated from seed, such as wheat, barley, and peas. Fruit and nut trees appeared later because their long generation times made selection slow. Techniques such as grafting allowed farmers to clone a superior tree rather than wait for uncertain offspring. Some crops could not be domesticated until farmers understood pollination or vegetative reproduction. Unconscious selection continued even after deliberate planting began. Harvesting with a sickle favored plants that held their seeds. Storing and sowing the largest seeds favored size. Cultivating dense stands reduced the advantage of wild branching forms and favored compact plants that directed energy into the desired part. Human transport also moved crops beyond the range of their wild ancestors, isolating them from wild populations and accelerating change. The transformation sometimes made plants incapable of survival without people. A non-shattering cereal cannot disperse its own seeds efficiently. A seedless banana cannot reproduce sexually. Domestication was therefore a coevolutionary relationship. Humans altered plants, and dependence on those plants altered human settlement, labor, diet, property, and population. Chapter 8. Apples or Indians. Diamond now asks why some regions with apparently fertile land never developed agriculture independently, while the Fertile Crescent did so early and rapidly. The answer cannot be that every region contained equally promising wild plants, and that only some peoples recognized their value. Wild species differ sharply in their suitability for domestication, and useful species must be considered as a complete local package rather than one by one. The Fertile Crescent possessed an unusually favorable collection of wild plants. It contained many annual grasses with large edible seeds, especially wheat and barley, as well as pulses such as peas, lentils, and chickpeas. Annual plants invest heavily in seeds because they must reproduce within a single season. The region's Mediterranean climate, with wet winters and long dry summers, selected species whose seeds could survive dry conditions and be stored. Many were already abundant in dense stands that hunter-gatherers could harvest efficiently. Their wild ancestors were self-pollinating, genetically flexible, and capable of becoming crops through relatively few mutations. The region also offered varied elevations within short distances. As the seasons changed, people could harvest plants ripening at different times and could observe a wide range of potential crops. Once cultivation began, the Fertile Crescent supplied a balanced package: carbohydrates from cereals, protein from pulses, oil from plants such as flax, fibers for cloth, and several domesticable mammals. Few other regions combined so many advantages. Diamond contrasts this package with food production in New Guinea and the eastern United States. New Guinea independently domesticated bananas, sugarcane, taro, and yams, but root crops were low in protein, difficult to store, and offered limited support for large political systems. The highlands lacked domesticable large mammals, and pigs arrived only from outside. The eastern United States developed crops such as sunflower, sumpweed, goosefoot, and local squash. These supported settled communities, but were less productive than the wheat, barley, and legumes of Southwest Asia. After maize, beans, and other Mexican crops arrived, they displaced or supplemented many local domesticates. The distribution of large-seeded grasses is especially revealing. A disproportionate share of the world's heaviest-seeded wild grasses occurred in western Eurasia and the Mediterranean zone. The Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia possessed fewer. North America did contain wild relatives of Eurasian apples and grapes, but the issue was not whether one useful plant existed. A society needed enough rewarding candidates to make a transition to food production worthwhile. Domesticating apples alone would not have created an agricultural economy. Diamond considers the possibility that indigenous peoples failed to notice plants that later breeders improved. He rejects this as implausible. Hunter-gatherers possess detailed knowledge of local species. When more productive foreign crops and animals became available, they often adopted them quickly. New Guinea farmers incorporated sweet potatoes, which transformed highland agriculture. Native American farmers accepted Eurasian crops and livestock after European contact. Their behavior shows practical intelligence and readiness to exploit superior species. The contrasting outcomes therefore reflect differing biological endowments. The Fertile Crescent offered many plants that could be domesticated rapidly and several large mammals that could be combined with them. New Guinea and the eastern United States developed agriculture from more limited packages, and consequently supported smaller populations and fewer technologies before foreign crops arrived. Regions such as California and temperate Australia offered still fewer suitable candidates. The title's contrast between apples and Indians is deliberately misleading. The central issue was not a failure by Native Americans to domesticate a particular fruit, but the limited total suite of plants and animals available to them. The Fertile Crescent's early advantage was reinforced by the condition of its wild plants before domestication. Some wild cereals were already highly productive and genetically close to forms useful to humans. Their seeds could be gathered with simple tools, dried, stored, and planted without complex processing. Many were hermaphroditic or self-pollinating, which preserved useful mutations rather than diluting them through crossing with wild plants. The first farmers, therefore, did not have to redesign an ecological system from nothing. The comparison with California is instructive. California had a Mediterranean climate and abundant wild foods, but its wild grasses generally offered smaller seeds and fewer immediately rewarding candidates. Acorns required extensive leaching, and no local package combined high-yield cereals, pulses, fiber crops, and domesticable herd mammals. Hunter-gatherers could prosper without creating the same feedback toward intensive agriculture. Diamond also considers the objection that the Fertile Crescent's inhabitants simply happened to be culturally more inventive. The region's food package spread quickly into Europe, North Africa, and South Asia, where unrelated peoples used it successfully. Conversely, descendants of the first farmers did not retain a permanent civilizational lead. The early advantage belonged to a biological and geographic package that could be transferred, not to a fixed population trait. Chapter 9. Zebras, Unhappy Marriages, and the Anna Karenina Principle. The same logic applies to large mammals. Diamond adapts the opening of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Domesticable animals are all alike, while every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. Successful domestication requires a species to meet several conditions simultaneously. Failure on any one condition can be decisive. Only a small number of large terrestrial mammals have been domesticated. The most important are the major five: sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and horses. Other domestic mammals include donkeys, camels, reindeer, water buffalo, yaks, Bali cattle, mithin, llamas, and alpacas. Almost all of these originated in Eurasia. The absence of native domestic mammals in many regions was not due to a lack of effort. Indigenous peoples readily adopted horses, cattle, sheep, and goats when they became available, demonstrating their value and the willingness of local societies to use them. Eurasia began with the largest pool of candidates. Its great area and ecological diversity supported many large mammal species. The Americas lost most of their large mammals near the end of the Ice Age, probably in part because newly arrived human hunters encountered animals that had not evolved fear of them. Australia suffered an even earlier extinction of large mammals. Sub-Saharan Africa retained many species, but none of its large candidates became major domestic animals. Familiarity with humans may have made African animals more dangerous and difficult to manage because they had evolved alongside human hunters. Diamond lists 6 major requirements. First, the animal must have a diet humans can afford. Carnivores are inefficient because producing 1 unit of predator meat requires many units of prey. Second, it must grow rapidly enough to justify the investment. Elephants can be trained, but reproduce too slowly to have been domesticated through controlled breeding on a large scale. Third, it must breed in captivity. Cheetahs and some other animals have elaborate courtship behavior that does not function in enclosures. Fourth, it must have a manageable disposition. African buffalo, hippos, and grizzly bears are powerful and unpredictable. Zebras bite, kick, and resist control despite superficial similarity to horses. Fifth, the animal must not panic uncontrollably when threatened. Many deer and antelope flee blindly and injure themselves in confinement. Sixth, the species should possess a social structure that humans can appropriate. The best domestic mammals live in herds, follow dominant individuals, tolerate close proximity, and have overlapping home ranges. Humans can insert themselves as leaders of such a hierarchy. Territorial, solitary animals resist this arrangement. These conditions explain why repeated attempts to domesticate apparently promising species failed. Ancient peoples captured, tamed, and even kept many animals, But taming individual animals differs from domestication, which changes a breeding population genetically. Domestic animals became smaller or more docile, changed body proportions, and often developed reduced brains and sensory organs because human protection replaced the need for constant vigilance. The Eurasian advantage was therefore both quantitative and qualitative. The continent had more candidate species and a higher proportion that satisfied the full set of requirements. It did not receive all domestic animals in one place, but its east-west connections later allowed many of them to spread. Other continents were not populated by people incapable of domestication. They lacked animals combining the necessary traits. Like a successful marriage in Tolstoy's analogy, domestication required many things to go right at once. The ancient 14 were domesticated over a relatively short span. After the major species had been brought under control, later civilizations did not add a second large set despite better science and deliberate breeding programs. Modern efforts to ranch eland, deer, zebras, and other species have produced limited commercial management rather than full domestication comparable to cattle or horses. This supports Diamond's claim that ancient peoples had already tried the plausible candidates and encountered biological limits. Different animals failed for different reasons. Rhinoceroses and hippos are dangerous. Deer may be manageable as individuals, but panic or resist breeding in confinement. Antelope often defend territories, or lack a stable dominance hierarchy that humans can control. African elephants have long been captured and trained, yet most working elephants were taken from the wild, rather than bred through many generations, so they were tamed but not domesticated. The zebra's tendency to bite, kick, and evade restraint made it unsuitable, despite its abundance and horse-like appearance. Dogs are an important partial exception to the focus on large herbivores. They were domesticated from wolves before agriculture and served in hunting, protection, transport, and companionship. Yet dogs did not provide the same quantity of meat, milk, traction, or mounted military power as the large Eurasian mammals. The unequal distribution of those larger species remained central to later differences. Chapter 10: Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes. Even after food production arose, its consequences depended on how easily crops, animals, and technologies could spread. Diamond emphasizes a basic geometric difference among continents. Eurasia extends mainly east and west, while the Americas and Africa extend mainly north and south. Places at similar latitudes tend to share day length, seasonal cycles, and often comparable climates and diseases. Moving north or south produces faster ecological change. The Fertile Crescent's crops and livestock therefore spread rapidly across western Eurasia. Wheat, barley, peas, sheep, goats, and cattle moved west into Europe and east toward the Indus Valley. Their wild ancestors often did not need to be domesticated again, because the existing domestic varieties arrived quickly and preempted local experiments. Similar diffusion carried crops and technologies across temperate Eurasia. The wheel, once developed, spread thousands of miles within a few centuries. Latitude is not the only factor. Mountains, deserts, rainfall regimes, and disease environments also matter. Fertile Crescent crops could reach Egypt and the cool Ethiopian highlands, but not easily pass into tropical Africa. Some tropical African crops moved south only as farmers crossed environments suitable for them. Within India, ecological differences slowed exchanges between the Indus Valley and the tropical south. Yet Eurasia generally offered long east-west bands in which crops encountered familiar growing seasons. The Americas presented stronger barriers. Mexican maize had to be transformed before it could mature in the shorter summers of North America. Movement between Mesoamerica and the Andes was obstructed by tropical lowlands, deserts, and the narrow Isthmus of Panama. Some important crops and domestic animals never crossed between the two great centers. Llamas remained confined to the Andes. The wheel existed in Mexican toys, but did not spread to the Andes or become a transport technology, partly because the Americas lacked suitable draft animals. Africa also imposed north-south transitions. Mediterranean crops from Southwest Asia could not pass easily through the tropics. Cattle faced diseases transmitted by tsetse flies. Tropical crops and Bantu-speaking farmers later expanded southward, where rainfall and growing conditions permitted, but exchange across the continent was slower than across Eurasia. New Guinea crops never reached the fertile temperate regions of southern Australia in prehistory because of sea gaps, deserts, and ecological discontinuities. Continental orientation shaped more than agriculture. Writing systems, inventions, states, and diseases spread along many of the same routes. A society that borrowed a crop or technology saved the time required to invent it independently. Eurasia's large connected zone therefore accumulated innovations generated by many populations. The contrast does not imply that east-west diffusion was automatic, or that north-south diffusion was impossible. It identifies a persistent difference in the friction confronting movement. Around the axes of continents, Diamond argues, turned much of the later history of power. The chapter's examples show that diffusion follows ecology, rather than simple distance. Fertile Crescent crops cross thousands of miles from the Atlantic coast to the Indus Valley more readily than they cross the shorter distance from Ethiopia into tropical Africa. In the Americas, the turkey never moved from Mesoamerica to the Andes, while the llama never moved north to Mexico. Maize did spread widely, but only after evolving varieties adapted to new day lengths and growing seasons. Eurasia's axis also encouraged the movement of domestic animals and pathogens. Animals adapted to temperate latitudes could travel across broad zones, bringing traction and disease. Political ideas and writing could move with the same populations. Each successful diffusion increased the value of the whole package. A crop supported more people supported specialists, and specialists improved transport and weapons that carried the crop farther. Diamond treats continental shape as a probabilistic influence. Mountain chains and deserts sometimes run east-west, and human decisions can overcome barriers. Nevertheless, repeated small differences in diffusion speed, compounded over millennia, can produce large historical gaps. A crop arriving 1,000 years earlier gives a society more time to grow, organize, and invent before its next major collision. Part 3. From Food to Guns, Germs, and Steel. The third part explains how food production generated the immediate instruments of conquest. Dense farming societies created epidemic diseases, supported writing and specialized invention, accumulated technologies through diffusion, and developed increasingly centralized political systems. Chapter 11. Lethal Gift of Livestock. The infectious diseases that killed the largest numbers of humans evolved mainly from microbes of animals. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, plague, and other major killers arose through long processes in which animal pathogens adapted to human bodies. Farming societies created the conditions that allowed those diseases to become permanent features of human history. Microbes spread in different ways and manipulate their hosts accordingly. Some provoke coughing or sneezing, others produce diarrhea and contaminate water, some depend on insects, while sexually transmitted organisms alter behavior less visibly because immobilizing the host would reduce transmission. Symptoms such as fever and inflammation may represent the body's defenses rather than the microbe's direct action. The evolutionary interests of pathogen and host can eventually produce a less lethal relationship, but new diseases often cause devastating epidemics. Crowd diseases require large populations. Measles, for example, cannot persist in a small isolated band because it quickly infects everyone and then disappears after survivors become immune. It needs a continuous supply of susceptible children and connections to other communities. Such diseases could not become established among dispersed hunter-gatherers. They flourished after agriculture created cities, trade routes, poor sanitation, and close contact among humans and livestock. The path from animal disease to human disease has several stages. Some infections pass occasionally from animals to people, but do not spread further. Others spread for a few generations and then vanish. A small number evolve into diseases transmitted entirely among humans. Diamond cites the relationship of measles to cattle diseases and of influenza to pigs and birds as examples of animal origins. Repeated exposure in Eurasian farming societies provided many opportunities for pathogens to cross the species barrier. Epidemics repeatedly shaped Eurasian history. Plague killed a large share of medieval Europe's population. Smallpox, measles, and influenza caused enormous mortality, but left surviving populations with acquired immunity and sometimes genetic resistance. When Europeans crossed the oceans, they carried a collection of infections accumulated from many Old World societies and domestic animals. The Americas had dense states and cities, but far fewer large domestic mammals. Llamas and alpacas were geographically restricted and did not live in the same intimate, crowded conditions as Eurasian cattle, pigs, and poultry. Native Americans therefore had few crowd diseases capable of infecting Europeans. When Old World pathogens arrived, smallpox and other epidemics often spread ahead of the conquerors, killing leaders, breaking political continuity, and depopulating entire regions. In Mexico and the Andes, disease was at least as important as weapons. Similar epidemics devastated Aboriginal Australians and Pacific Islanders. Diamond does not claim that every epidemic disease came directly from livestock or that immunity was complete. Europeans continued to die from their own diseases, and tropical diseases such as malaria and yellow fever sometimes obstructed European settlement. His argument concerns the unequal package. Eurasia's long history of dense farming populations and diverse domestic animals generated many more crowd infections. The germs were an unintended product of food production, but they became among its most lethal gifts. Diamond organizes infectious diseases into broad categories. Some, such as leprosy or yaws, can persist slowly in small populations. Others, including measles and smallpox, are acute crowd diseases that confer immunity or kill, so they need large connected populations. Still others remain in animal reservoirs and repeatedly infect humans. These categories explain why the most devastating epidemic package arose in regions containing dense cities, domestic herds, and frequent trade. The evolutionary transition from an animal pathogen is difficult. A microbe must enter a human, survive the immune system, reproduce, and then acquire a route to another human. Most attempts end immediately. The diseases visible in history are the rare successful outcomes of countless exposures involving herders, farmers, animal waste, insects, and food. Eurasia's many domestic species and long farming history created more experiments than the Americas or Australia. The direction of disease exchange was not entirely one-sided. Europeans encountered malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses in tropical regions, and the origin of syphilis remains debated. But the central asymmetry is clear in the recorded mortality. No American epidemic swept Europe after Columbus in a way comparable to smallpox in Mexico or the Andes. The lack of American crowd diseases follows from smaller total populations, later urbanization, and especially the shortage of domestic herd animals. Chapter 12. Blueprints and Borrowed Letters. Writing allowed states to transmit orders, keep accounts, preserve laws, record taxes, guide navigation, and accumulate knowledge across generations. At Cajamarca, written reports gave the Spaniards information about distant peoples and earlier campaigns, while the Incas relied on oral communication and limited record systems. Diamond asks why writing arose independently in only a few places, and why it spread unevenly. A complete writing system must represent language rather than merely objects or ideas. Systems combine several principles. Logograms represent whole words, syllabaries represent syllables, alphabets represent individual sounds. Early systems were often mixtures, difficult to learn, and restricted to professional scribes. The earliest indisputable independent invention occurred in Sumer before 3000 BC. It began with accounting marks for goods and quantities, and gradually developed phonetic signs, logograms, and determinatives. A second independent invention occurred in Mesoamerica. Egyptian and Chinese writing may also have arisen independently, although possible inspiration from neighboring systems is debated. Most later scripts descended from existing ones or were created after knowledge that writing was possible. Diamond distinguishes blueprint copying from idea diffusion. Blueprint copying adapts the actual signs or principles of an existing script. The alphabet traveled through long chains of borrowing. Semitic systems influenced Phoenician, Greek, Etruscan, and Roman scripts, while Aramaic contributed to Hebrew, Arabic, and many Asian scripts. Greek writers improved a consonantal alphabet by using signs for vowels. Idea diffusion occurs when people learn that writing can be invented, but design their own symbols. The Cherokee syllabary created by Sequoyah illustrates both processes. He copied some visible forms from English print without knowing their English sounds, assigned them new values, and invented additional signs suited to Cherokee. Writing generally emerged in food-producing societies with centralized governments. Early scripts served rulers, temples, and administrators. Sumerian tablets recorded goods, labor, and tribute. Mycenaean Linear B was used largely for palace accounts. Complex scripts were useful, partly because their difficulty preserved a monopoly for scribes. Broad literary use was not the original purpose. After Mycenaean civilization collapsed, Greece lost writing for centuries. When writing returned through the alphabet, it served poetry, humor, and private communication, as well as government. Some politically complex societies, including the Inca Empire, functioned without full writing. Others lacked it because they were isolated from the few independent centers and did not have enough time or administrative demand to invent it. Hawaii and Tonga lay thousands of miles from literate societies. The Andes, West Africa, and the Mississippi region were geographically closer, but deserts, oceans, tropical zones, and north-south ecological barriers slowed diffusion. Corn could spread where scripts did not, and even corn moved slowly across some barriers. Writing was therefore neither a simple measure of intelligence nor an inevitable discovery. Independent invention was exceptionally difficult. Most societies acquired it from others, which made location and connectivity decisive. The same geography that affected crops and animals also affected the movement of information technologies. The route from pictorial marks to full writing required several conceptual breakthroughs. A sign could stand for an object, then for the spoken word naming that object, and finally for a sound used in unrelated words. The rebus principle allowed scribes to represent abstract terms through phonetic resemblance. Determinatives clarified which meaning was intended. These solutions were not obvious, which helps explain the rarity of independent invention. Mesoamerican writing developed independently, eventually producing the sophisticated Maya script. Chinese characters followed their own principles and probably arose independently as well. Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared near the time of Sumerian writing, leaving open the possibility of stimulus diffusion without direct copying. In the Indus Valley, preserved signs remain undeciphered, so scholars cannot yet determine whether they represent a full language system. The alphabet was revolutionary not because it was created from nothing, but because successive borrowers simplified earlier scripts. Semitic speakers used signs primarily for consonants. Greeks reassigned unnecessary signs to vowels, making pronunciation more explicit. The resulting system could be learned by more people than a script containing hundreds of signs, although literacy still depended on schooling, materials, and political demand. Chapter 13. Necessity's Mother. The familiar proverb claims that necessity is the mother of invention, but Diamond argues that invention often precedes recognized need. Many technologies begin as novelties whose important uses appear later. The phonograph was not initially conceived primarily as a music machine. Early automobiles seemed impractical, and the first internal combustion engines had limited purposes. Inventors create possibilities. Societies then select, modify, or reject them. The Phaistos disc from ancient Crete illustrates the unpredictability of technological history. Its symbols were impressed with reusable stamps, an apparent early step toward printing with movable type. Yet the technique disappeared, and was not followed by a printing revolution. An invention succeeds only if it fits available materials, economic demand, complementary technologies, and social institutions. Diamond reviews explanations that credit heroic inventors, national cultures, war, climate, leisure, or centralized government. Each captures some cases, but fails as a general theory. War can accelerate weapons and transport, yet can also destroy skilled communities. Strong governments promoted technology in 19th century Germany and Japan, but suppressed innovation in Ming China. Harsh climates may reward invention, but many advanced technologies arose in warm regions. New Guinea contains neighboring societies that differ in receptiveness, even though they share similar environments. Most technology is borrowed rather than invented locally. Societies acquire tools from neighbors, merchants, migrants, enemies, or conquered peoples. They may copy a design directly, adopt only its underlying idea, or combine it with local practices. Geographic isolation therefore limits accumulation. Tasmania, cut off from mainland Australia for thousands of years, lost or failed to maintain technologies that its ancestors had possessed, including some fishing equipment and bone tools. A small population offered few inventors, few specialists, and few external sources from which to reacquire lost skills. Technology develops cumulatively. One invention becomes a component of another. Printing required paper, inks, presses, metallurgy, and writing. firearms depended on gunpowder, metalworking, projectiles, and manufacturing. Because invention is autocatalytic, an early lead can widen. Societies with many existing technologies are better able to generate and adopt more. Population and connectivity influence the number of opportunities. Eurasia combined the world's largest landmass, large populations, early food production, and extensive routes of exchange. No single Eurasian people invented everything. Chinese, Southwest Asian, Indian, Islamic, and European societies contributed different elements, which moved among regions. Europe eventually benefited from innovations such as paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder that originated elsewhere. Diamond insists that isolated peoples were not lacking in ingenuity. New Guineans solved difficult problems of agriculture, hunting, construction, and survival with locally available materials. Their potential inventors worked on problems relevant to New Guinea rather than phonographs or steam engines. Continental differences in technology resulted from the number of societies contributing inventions, the ease of diffusion, population size, and the time since food production began. Technology then reinforced its own growth, magnifying relatively small initial differences. Diamond discusses several factors that affect whether a society accepts a new technology. It must offer a visible advantage over existing methods, fit local economic needs, and be compatible with social prestige or power. Ease of observing the invention matters. So does the ability of vested interests to suppress it. A technology can be technically superior yet fail because it threatens rulers, guilds, religious authorities, or established investments. Diffusion may be peaceful, coerced, or accidental. A society can buy an invention, copy captured weapons, recruit foreign artisans, or be conquered by users of the technology. Neighboring competition creates pressure to adopt innovations that would otherwise be rejected. Isolated societies have more freedom to refuse, but refusal can become permanent because there is no rival demonstrating the costs. The autocatalytic character of technology also explains reversals. A society may lose a complex tool if population falls or trade networks collapse. Once complementary skills disappear, restoring the tool becomes harder. Technological history is therefore neither a straight line nor a record of inventions appearing exactly when needed. It is a branching process of invention, diffusion, acceptance, modification, and loss. Chapter 14. From Egalitarianism to Kleptocracy. Human societies range from small bands to tribes, chiefdoms, states, and empires. Diamond uses these categories as simplified points on a continuum, not rigid stages through which every society must pass. The central problem is why large populations repeatedly develop centralized authority, social hierarchy, economic specialization, and institutions that transfer resources to elites. Bands usually contain a few dozen related people. They lack formal offices, permanent bureaucracy, taxation, and sharp class divisions. Decisions emerge through discussion and influence. Tribes contain hundreds of people organized in villages and kin groups. They may have informal leaders but remain relatively egalitarian. Because most members know one another personally, disputes can be managed through relationships and shared norms. Chiefdoms contain thousands or tens of thousands of people. Strangers must interact, and hereditary chiefs exercise recognized authority. Tribute flows toward the center and may be redistributed through feasts, public works, or support for specialists. Rank becomes inherited, and leaders claim privileged access to land, goods, or the supernatural. States contain still larger populations, formal laws, professional officials, police, armies, territorial administration, and more pronounced classes. Large societies require centralization for practical reasons. Personal dispute resolution fails when most people are strangers. Uncontrolled revenge can produce cycles of violence. A government monopolizes force and provides courts. Economic specialization also requires redistribution and exchange among farmers, craftspeople, soldiers, and administrators. Public work, such as irrigation or defense, may require coordinated labor. Information and decisions must pass through a hierarchy because a population of millions cannot deliberate as a face-to-face group. Food production and political complexity reinforce each other. Agriculture supports dense populations and surpluses, making chiefs and states possible. Central authorities then intensify production through irrigation, storage, conquest, and organization. This feedback does not make states inevitable, but it gives centralized societies military advantages. They can mobilize large armies, collect supplies, and impose unified strategy. Diamond rejects the idea that states usually arose through a voluntary social contract. Smaller units often merged under external threat or were conquered by one of their neighbors. Population growth created pressure, conflict, and the need for organization. In some cases, a leader used military innovation or ideology to dominate rivals. The Zulu state, for example, gained power through political and military organization rather than superior guns, writing, or germs. The title's word kleptocracy refers to the danger that leaders use centralization mainly to enrich themselves. Elites maintain legitimacy in several ways. They disarm the population and concentrate force. They redistribute part of the tribute in popular ways. They maintain order and provide services. They construct an ideology or religion that presents authority as sacred and sacrifice as honorable. Monumental buildings and ceremonies convert surplus into visible proof of collective power. Chiefdoms and states also treat defeated peoples differently from bands and tribes. Agricultural surpluses make slavery and regular tribute profitable. Conquered populations may be left in place, taxed, and incorporated. Centralized societies can therefore grow through conquest, becoming empires. The evolution from bands to states was not a story of moral progress. It created peace within larger territories and enabled complex economies. But it also institutionalized inequality, warfare, taxation, forced labor, and rule by elites. Leaders can convert tribute into legitimacy rather than simply consuming it. They may organize irrigation, redistribute food during famine, sponsor ceremonies, protect trade, or build monuments that create shared identity. A successful ruling class gives enough back to persuade subjects that hierarchy serves a collective purpose. When extraction becomes too naked, elites face rebellion, secession, or conquest by a better organized rival. Ideology enlarges military capacity by encouraging people to die for individuals they have never met. Small groups fight for relatives and companions. States require loyalty to a king, god, nation, or moral order. Religious institutions can justify taxation and conquest while also providing education, charity, and coordination. The same structures that make large, peaceful communities possible can mobilize violence on an unprecedented scale. Diamond's sequence is not an evolutionary ladder placing modern states above all other societies in human worth. Bands and tribes may offer more equality and autonomy, while states provide security and material complexity at the cost of bureaucracy and coercion. The historical advantage belongs to scale. When societies of unequal organization collide, the one capable of mobilizing more people and resources usually prevails. Part 4. Around the World in 6 chapters. The final part tests the general argument against regional histories. Diamond examines Australia and New Guinea, China, the Austronesian expansion, the collision of Eurasia with the Americas, the spread of peoples and crops across Africa, and the disputed origins of the Japanese. In each case, he connects local outcomes to food production, geography, migration, disease, diffusion, and political organization. Chapter 15. Yali's People. Australia and New Guinea once formed a single landmass, often called Greater Australia, and were populated by humans at least 40,000 years ago. Rising sea levels later separated New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. Because their inhabitants shared ancient origins but developed radically different societies, the region provides a demanding test of environmental explanation. New Guinea's highlands supported intensive food production based on taro, yams, bananas, sugarcane, and other indigenous crops. Farmers constructed drainage systems, altered slopes, and maintained dense villages. Pigs, introduced from Asia, became economically and socially important. New Guineans developed bows and arrows, polished stone axes, elaborate trade, and hundreds of languages. Yet they did not form large states, acquire metal tools, or develop writing before European contact. Australia remained predominantly a continent of hunter-gatherers. It had no native domesticable large mammals after the extinction of its megafauna. Its soils are generally old, nutrient-poor, and unreliable. Rainfall varies unpredictably, and much of the interior is arid. Although fertile regions exist, they are separated by deserts and other barriers. Aboriginal societies developed sophisticated knowledge and management of local environments, including fire regimes, seasonal movement, and the harvesting of many species, but most regions could not support the dense sedentary populations associated with agriculture. The contrast was not caused by the abilities of the inhabitants. The same ancient colonizing population gave rise to both. New Guinea's wet highlands offered productive root crops, while Australia lacked comparable indigenous candidates and suffered harsher ecological constraints. New Guinea itself also faced limitations. Root crops supplied calories but little protein, were difficult to store for long periods, and could not easily support centralized taxation. The highlands were fragmented by rugged terrain, encouraging linguistic and political division. The region lacked large domestic animals for traction and transport, while pigs did not pull plows or carry heavy loads. Diamond asks why New Guinea food production and technology did not cross Torres Strait into Australia. The gap is narrow, and some influences did pass. Outrigger canoes, shellfish hooks, dogs related to the dingo, and cultural practices reached parts of northern Australia. But the agricultural systems of tropical New Guinea were poorly suited to most Australian environments. The people most capable of transferring highland farming lived far from the strait. Cape York, the nearest Australian region, was ecologically different from the New Guinea highlands and separated from southeastern Australia's more temperate areas by great distances and difficult terrain. Australia also received limited influence from Indonesia. Moccasin sailors visited northern coasts to collect sea cucumbers and traded with Aboriginal communities, but they did not establish a large farming population. Austronesian settlers had transformed many islands farther north. Yet Australia's deserts, poor soils, and variable climate reduced the advantage of their tropical crops. European colonization did not demonstrate that Australia had always been easy to farm. Europeans arrived with crops, sheep, cattle, metal tools, ships, scientific knowledge, global trade, and institutions accumulated across Eurasia. Even then, settlement concentrated in particular coastal and temperate zones, and required imported species and technology. The inhabitants, who had created a sustainable society using only Australia's native resources, were Aboriginal Australians. Their technology was appropriate to the opportunities and limits of the continent. Tasmania illustrates the effects of isolation and population size. After sea levels cut it off from Australia, its small population lost some technologies, including bone tools and certain fishing practices. Diamond interprets this not as intellectual decline, but as the vulnerability of a small, isolated community. Complex skills can disappear when the few people who know them die, when occasional failures discourage their use, or when no neighboring society can reintroduce them. The chapter's conclusion is comparative. New Guinea's environment permitted indigenous food production and dense farming communities, but limited political unification and technological diffusion. Australia's environment favored mobile hunting and gathering across most of the continent. Eurasian settlers later conquered both regions because they arrived with an enormous package built elsewhere. Environment shaped what local peoples could develop before that encounter. Diamond cautions against describing Aboriginal society as static. Different regions varied greatly. The Murray-Darling River system supported relatively dense populations and intensive harvesting. Some communities constructed fish traps, managed stands of useful plants, and returned seasonally to favored sites. Fire was used to reshape vegetation and promote game. These practices blurred the boundary between passive gathering and food production, but did not generate domestic species capable of supporting continent-wide agricultural expansion. New Guinea's population also transformed its environment. Highland farmers cleared forests, built fences and ditches, and selected useful plants. Yet their agricultural package imposed nutritional and logistical constraints. Protein shortages encouraged the importance of pigs, but pigs competed with humans for food and were not abundant enough to support cavalry or traction. Without wheeled transport or large pack animals, moving surplus across steep mountains remained expensive. The comparison helps clarify Diamond's use of the word simplicity. Aboriginal technologies used fewer material types than Eurasian industrial systems, but survival required detailed knowledge of water, plants, animals, and seasonal variability. A short-lived European visitor could die in an environment where Aboriginal communities had lived for millennia. Technological complexity and intellectual capacity are not interchangeable. Chapter 16. How China Became Chinese. Modern China appears unusually unified in language, culture, and political identity, but Diamond argues that this unity was historically produced through expansion and absorption. Northern and Southern Chinese differ genetically and physically, reflecting older populations adapted to different climates. More than 100 minority languages survive, often in scattered enclaves, as remnants of a formerly more diverse linguistic landscape. China contained at least two major early centers of food production. Northern farmers cultivated drought-resistant millets, while southern farmers domesticated rice and other crops adapted to warmer and wetter conditions. Pigs, chickens, and other animals contributed to dense populations. China's long east-west rivers and relatively connected core regions allowed crops, people, technologies, and political institutions to move between north and south, although ecological differences slowed some exchanges. Linguistic evidence suggests that speakers of Sino-Tibetan languages expanded from northern China. Southern China was formerly occupied more broadly by speakers of Miao-Yao, Austroasiatic, and Tai-Kadai languages. As northern states expanded, many southern populations adopted Chinese languages and political institutions, while others moved into the hills or farther south. Their descendants include language communities across mainland Southeast Asia. Political unification culminated under the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, after earlier northern states had spread administrative models and military power southward. Governments promoted standard writing, measures, roads, and official culture. Conquest, migration, and assimilation gradually made much of China Chinese. Some southern innovations, including rice cultivation and iron technology, moved north, so unification was not a one-way transfer of civilization. It joined complementary regional developments. Chinese writing reinforced unity. A system perfected in the north spread across populations speaking different dialects and languages. Because its signs were not tied as closely to pronunciation as an alphabet, officials in different regions could read the same texts. Chinese cultural prestige later influenced Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The persistence of Chinese-derived writing in Japan and, until recently, Korea reflects a chain beginning with early food production and state formation. China's apparent ethnic uniformity is therefore the outcome of prehistoric and historical expansion, comparable in important respects to European colonization elsewhere, but occurring largely within East Asia. Food production gave some populations the density, technology, and state organization to absorb others. The surviving linguistic fragments reveal the diversity that preceded political and cultural consolidation. China's north-south integration was aided by its two great river systems and broad eastern plains. The Yellow River region and the Yangtze Basin could exchange crops and technologies while remaining parts of a connected political core. By contrast, Europe possesses multiple peninsulas, mountain barriers, and separate river basins. These geographic differences later contributed to China's recurrent unification and Europe's persistent plurality. The expansion southward did not simply erase populations. Many conquered peoples were biologically absorbed and became ancestors of modern southern Chinese. Cultural replacement could therefore be much more complete than genetic replacement. People adopted the language, state institutions, and identity of the expanding civilization while retaining substantial local ancestry. The distinction helps explain how a country can appear culturally homogeneous despite deep regional genetic differences. The same farming expansions that unified China also projected populations outward. Austroasiatic, Tai-Kadai, and Miao-Yao speakers moved into Southeast Asia under pressure from Sino-Tibetan expansion. Other southern Chinese farmers moved toward Taiwan and became ancestors of the Austronesian dispersal. China became Chinese while helping create the linguistic map of much of East Asia and the Pacific. Chapter 17. Speedboat to Polynesia. The Austronesian expansion carried related languages and peoples from Taiwan through the Philippines and Indonesia, along the coast of New Guinea, and across thousands of miles of the Pacific to Polynesia. Diamond reconstructs this movement through linguistics, archaeology, crops, animals, pottery, and human genetics. The Austronesian language family has several primary branches confined to Taiwan, and one enormous branch, Malayo-Polynesian, spoken across most of the islands beyond it. This pattern identifies Taiwan as the likely homeland because the greatest linguistic diversity usually persists near a family's place of origin. The ancestors of Austronesian speakers were farmers related to populations of coastal southern China. They brought rice, pigs, chickens, pottery, polished stone tools, and advanced canoes. From Taiwan, settlers reached the Philippines and moved south and west through Indonesia. Their double outrigger sailing canoes were more stable and capable than simple dugouts, permitting regular ocean travel. In the Philippines and western Indonesia, the resident populations were largely hunter-gatherers. Austronesian farmers could support denser populations and possess stronger maritime technology, tools, and probably disease resistance. They replaced or absorbed many earlier inhabitants so thoroughly that little of the previous linguistic landscape survived. The result changed near New Guinea. New Guineans already practiced food production and supported dense populations. Austronesian settlers established themselves mainly on coasts and small offshore islands, rather than sweeping through the interior. Their distinctive lapita pottery appears across the Bismarck archipelago and farther east. They exchanged crops, animals, and technologies with Papuan-speaking peoples, producing mixed biological and cultural populations. Papuan languages continued to dominate the highlands and much of the interior. The expansion then accelerated into the previously uninhabited islands of the Pacific. Settlers carrying the lapita cultural package reached Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, and their descendants eventually colonized the Society Islands, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. As Chapter 2 showed, their societies diverged after settlement, because island environments differed. Not every Austronesian migration produced the same result. In Indonesia, farmers largely replaced hunter-gatherers. In New Guinea, they encountered established farmers and made limited territorial gains. In remote Oceania, they settled empty islands. Some later Austronesian speakers crossed the Indian Ocean and colonized Madagascar, where the Malagasy language retains close ties to Borneo, despite substantial African ancestry and cultural influence. The pattern supports Diamond's broader mechanism: access to a productive food package, maritime technology, and large connected populations enabled expansion. Where those advantages confronted hunter-gatherers, population replacement was extensive. Where they confronted other food producers, the result was resistance, coexistence, and mixture. The spread was neither a simple expression of superior courage nor an automatic movement of one race. It was a historically specific interaction between technology, subsistence, geography, and the societies already present. Linguistic reconstruction identifies parts of the migrants' original economy. Related Austronesian languages preserve shared words for boats, paddles, rice, taro, pigs, and other features, suggesting that these belonged to the ancestral culture before dispersal. Archaeology traces a matching sequence of red-slipped pottery, stone adzes, and village sites from Taiwan to the Philippines and onward. The colonization of remote Oceania required deliberate navigation rather than accidental drifting alone. Settlers transported not just people, but a planned biological package of crops, chickens, pigs, and dogs. Some animals or plants failed on particular islands, forcing later adaptation. Once the expansion passed the Solomon Islands, each new landfall contained no previous human population, so the migrants became founders rather than conquerors. Madagascar demonstrates the extraordinary reach of Austronesian seafaring. Its settlers crossed most of the Indian Ocean and established a language related most closely to one spoken in southeastern Borneo. African migrants and crops later became equally important, leaving a society whose ancestry and culture combined two distant continents. This is another case in which language, genes, and material culture preserve different parts of a complex migration history. Chapter 18. Hemispheres Colliding. The European conquest of the Americas was the largest recent population replacement, but its causes originated thousands of years before Columbus. Diamond compares Eurasia and the Americas to explain why ships crossed the Atlantic mainly from east to west, and why European societies conquered American states rather than the reverse. Both hemispheres contained independent centers of agriculture and complex civilizations. Mesoamerica produced maize, beans, squash, writing, cities, and powerful states. The Andes developed potatoes, llamas, metalworking, roads, and the Inca Empire. Yet food production began later in the Americas and spread more slowly. The first Americans arrived after the extinction of many large mammals, leaving only a few domesticable species. The llama and alpaca were useful for wool, meat, and transport, but were confined to the Andes and could not pull plows or carry riders into battle. American crops also faced severe geographic barriers. The north-south orientation of the continents forced plants to cross changes in day length, climate, rainfall, and disease. Tropical lowlands separated Mesoamerica from the Andes. Deserts and narrow land connections impeded exchange. Maize required long genetic adaptation before moving into temperate North America. As a result, the main centers shared fewer crops, animals, and technologies than did Eurasian regions. Eurasia developed a larger and more interconnected population. Crops and livestock moved across broad east-west zones. Inventions in writing systems circulated among Europe, North Africa, Southwest Asia, India, and China. Competition among many states promoted borrowing and military development. Dense populations living with livestock generated crowd diseases. The Americas had large cities, but their limited domestic mammals produced fewer epidemic pathogens. When the hemispheres collided after 1492, germs caused the greatest destruction. Smallpox killed millions and contributed to political crises in both the Aztec and Inca worlds. Measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases repeatedly struck populations with no previous exposure. Mortality varied, but often reached levels that shattered communities and made organized resistance difficult. Few American diseases caused comparable epidemics in Europe. Technology and political organization completed the imbalance. Europeans had steel swords, guns, horses, ocean-going ships, compasses, and writing. American societies possessed remarkable technologies, but lacked iron weapons, large military animals, and ships capable of crossing the Atlantic. Writing was restricted to parts of Mesoamerica and did not spread to the Andes. The Incas used quipus for administration, but lacked the broad written records available to Europeans. Diamond rejects the idea that these differences reflected a general inferiority of American peoples. Native societies rapidly adopted horses and other Eurasian technologies when circumstances allowed. Plains peoples transformed their economies and warfare around the horse. The problem was historical timing. Eurasian societies arrived with an accumulated package formed by a larger landmass, more domesticable species, earlier food production, and easier diffusion. The chapter also notes that European conquest was not equally easy everywhere. Tropical diseases obstructed settlement in some regions, and centralized states sometimes organized stronger resistance than scattered groups. Indigenous allies were essential to Spanish victories. Nevertheless, the broad direction of conquest followed the unequal distribution of germs, domestic animals, metallurgy, ships, and recorded knowledge. Diamond compares the starting conditions of the hemispheres around 11,000 BC. Eurasia had a much larger area and population, while the Americas had only recently been settled. The Fertile Crescent soon developed a highly productive agricultural package. Mesoamerican maize began as a less immediately productive crop and required prolonged selection. Some American domesticates, such as beans, could not be efficiently cultivated until other crops and techniques were in place. The unequal exchange of writing illustrates the consequences of internal barriers. Mesoamerican civilizations developed full scripts, but those systems did not reach the Andes. The Inca state compensated with roads, runners, administrative memory, and knotted quipus, but it could not draw on thousands of written accounts from another hemisphere. In Eurasia, even societies that did not invent writing could borrow it from neighbors. Spanish success should not be confused with effortless control. Conquest required decades of warfare, indigenous allies, missionary institutions, and repeated migration. Some Native American societies resisted for centuries, yet the direction of population movement remained overwhelmingly European because disease continually weakened indigenous communities, while ships replenished settlers, weapons, animals, and supplies from across the Atlantic. Chapter 19. How Africa Became Black. Africa is often imagined as a continent populated uniformly by black peoples, but it contains extraordinary diversity. Diamond distinguishes several broad population groups and language families, shaped by migration, conquest, and the spread of food production. The modern map is the result of historical expansions, rather than an unchanged racial geography. North Africa has long been connected biologically and culturally to Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean. The Sahara contains, or formerly contained peoples, adapted to desert environments. The Horn of Africa includes Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations with distinctive histories. Central African forests preserve small populations often labeled pygmies, while southern Africa includes Khoisan-speaking peoples whose languages use click consonants. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is now occupied by speakers of Bantu languages, one branch of the Niger-Congo family. Language geography reveals the direction of major movements. Niger-Congo languages are most diverse in West Africa, suggesting an origin there. Bantu languages spread from a region near modern Cameroon across central, eastern, and southern Africa. Their speakers carried agriculture, pottery, and eventually ironworking. They encountered hunter-gatherers and pastoralists whose descendants survive in reduced areas, or whose languages disappeared. African food production had several sources. Southwest Asian crops such as wheat and barley reached North Africa and Ethiopia, but could not spread easily through tropical climates. The Sahel domesticated crops, including sorghum and African millet. West Africa developed yams, oil palm, and other plants. Ethiopia contributed crops adapted to its highlands. Cattle, sheep, and goats arrived from Eurasia, although disease environments restricted their distribution. The Bantu expansion was possible because farmers could support denser populations than hunter-gatherers. Iron tools later improved forest clearing and agriculture, though the sequence varied regionally. As Bantu communities moved, they absorbed, displaced, or killed many earlier inhabitants. In eastern and southern Africa, they encountered pastoral peoples and Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherers. Bantu languages and ancestry became dominant across a huge area, while cliques incorporated into some Bantu languages preserve evidence of contact with Khoisan speakers. Africa's north-south axis slowed the movement of crops and livestock. Mediterranean species encountered tropical heat and rainfall. Tropical crops could not thrive in the temperate south. The tsetse fly transmitted diseases lethal to cattle and horses, limiting animal traction and cavalry in many regions. These barriers contributed to the uneven distribution of food production, states, and technology. Madagascar offers striking evidence of long-distance migration. Its language is Austronesian and closely related to languages of Borneo, even though the island lies near Africa, and its people have mixed African and Asian ancestry. Austronesian sailors crossed the Indian Ocean, bringing crops and cultural practices, and later mixed with African settlers. European colonization again depended heavily on germs and ecology. In temperate southern Africa, European crops and livestock prospered, and settlers expanded into lands occupied by Khoisan peoples and Bantu farmers. In tropical Africa, malaria and other diseases killed Europeans at high rates and delayed permanent conquest until medicine and technology improved. Europeans possessed guns and political resources, but their biological advantage was smaller than in the Americas because Africans had long exposure to many Old World diseases. The phrase, "how Africa became black," therefore describes a process. Bantu-speaking farmers expanded because their crop packages, population density, and technologies gave them advantages over many hunter-gatherers. Other populations survived in ecological refuges, mixed with migrants, or shifted languages. The same mechanisms used to explain European expansion also operated among non-European peoples within Africa. Diamond identifies 5 broad African population groupings for analytical purposes: peoples often called blacks, whites of North African affiliation, pygmies, Khoisan peoples, and Asians represented especially in Madagascar. These are not pure races with fixed boundaries. Centuries of mixture make appearance, language, and ancestry overlap. The categories are tools for reconstructing movements, not claims that Africans fit into separate biological boxes. The Khoisan case is especially revealing. Their languages were once spread much more widely across southern Africa. Bantu languages that now contain click sounds probably acquired them through contact with Khoisan speakers, preserving a linguistic trace after population absorption. European settlement later compressed Khoisan communities further, so the current distribution understates their former importance. The expansion also had limits. In the far south, Mediterranean climate crops later introduced by Europeans succeeded where tropical Bantu crops were less productive. In forest regions, pygmy communities maintained specialized knowledge and exchanged relationships with neighboring farmers. Africa's history was therefore not one uniform Bantu replacement, but a mosaic of migration, intermarriage, language shift, ecological adaptation, and resistance. Chapter 20. Who are the Japanese? Japan's origins are politically sensitive because Japanese identity has often been presented as ancient, homogeneous, and separate from Korea. Diamond compares archaeology, genetics, physical anthropology, language, and historical records to evaluate competing accounts. The earliest modern inhabitants of Japan arrived when lower sea levels connected or nearly connected the islands to the Asian mainland. The Jomon culture, beginning many thousands of years ago, produced some of the world's earliest pottery. Jomon people lived mainly by hunting, fishing, and gathering, although they managed plants and developed settled communities in resource-rich regions. Their pottery, tools, and regional diversity reveal a complex society without intensive grain agriculture. Around 400 BC, a new cultural complex called Yayoi appeared in northern Kyushu and spread through much of Japan. Yayoi sites contained irrigated rice agriculture, metal tools, new pottery styles, and social hierarchy. These features closely resembled developments in Korea and China. The transition was too rapid to be explained only by independent invention. Diamond considers three models. In one, modern Japanese descend mainly from Jomon people who adopted Korean crops and technologies. In a second, incoming Korean farmers replaced the Jomon almost completely. In a third, substantial migration combined with local ancestry. He favors the third model, with a large demographic contribution from Korea. Rice farmers could support much denser populations than hunter-gatherers, so even a modest initial migration could expand rapidly over generations. Genetic and skeletal evidence places most modern Japanese closer to Koreans and other East Asians than to the Ainu, who retain more Jomon ancestry. Yet regional differences and inherited features show mixture rather than total replacement. The Ryukyu Islanders and Ainu preserve additional evidence of populations less affected by the Yayoi expansion. Language poses complications. Japanese and Korean share grammatical similarities but are not transparently close in basic vocabulary. Diamond suggests that the language brought by Yayoi migrants may have belonged to an earlier Korean linguistic landscape and differed from the language that later became modern Korean. Place names and regional survivals indicate that multiple languages existed. The Ainu language cannot simply be treated as the sole original language of all Jomon Japan. Political organization developed as rice agriculture, metallurgy, and continental influence spread. Early Japanese states borrowed Chinese writing, Buddhism, administrative models, and technologies, often through Korea. Later historical narratives minimized Korean contributions as relations became hostile and national identities hardened. Diamond's conclusion is that Japanese and Koreans are deeply connected. Modern Japanese culture emerged from Jomon foundations, combined with major Yayoi migration and subsequent borrowing from Korea and China. Recognition of those shared origins is difficult because archaeology intersects with modern nationalism. Yet understanding the mixture undermines myths of racial purity and may encourage a less antagonistic view of East Asian history. The Jomon-Yayoi transition can be compared to other expansions of farmers over hunter-gatherers. Rice agriculture created a large demographic multiplier. If each farming community supported many more children per acre, migrants did not need to arrive in overwhelming numbers at once. Continued growth over centuries could make their descendants dominant while still leaving substantial Jomon ancestry. Early Japanese chronicles connected rulers to divine origins and treated relations with Korea through the politics of later courts. Archaeology offers a different perspective, revealing continuous exchange across the Korea Strait. Iron tools, bronze objects, rice cultivation, tomb forms, and political institutions all point to continental connections. Modern national borders can obscure the fact that ancient southern Korea and western Japan formed parts of an interacting regional world. The question is difficult not because evidence is absent, but because conclusions affect identity. Koreans may resist claims that Japanese culture grew from migrants from the peninsula because of Japan's later colonization of Korea. Japanese nationalists may resist the same evidence because it challenges uniqueness. Diamond uses the case to show why historical science must separate the emotional consequences of a conclusion from the evidence supporting it. Epilogue: The Future of Human History as a Science. Diamond returns to Yali's question. His answer is that continental differences in long-term history arose primarily from environmental differences affecting domesticable plants and animals, the timing of food production, continental axes, barriers to diffusion, population size, and isolation. Food production supported germs, writing, technology, and centralized government. These proximate agents then enabled conquest. The causal chain does not reduce individual decisions to geography, but it explains why societies began with unequal sets of opportunities. The explanation raises another question. If Eurasia as a whole possessed long-term advantages, why did Western Europe eventually dominate rather than China or the Fertile Crescent? Europe was backward for much of recorded history. It borrowed agriculture, writing, metallurgy, and other technologies from older centers. China led the world in many inventions, including paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, and cast iron. The Fertile Crescent lost its early lead, partly because its environment was fragile. Farming and herding caused erosion, deforestation, and salinization. Political and economic centers shifted westward to regions that had received Fertile Crescent crops but possessed more durable rainfall and soils. Europe inherited the package, while the original center became ecologically degraded. China's decline relative to Europe involved political geography. China possessed broad connected core regions and became repeatedly unified. Unity offered enormous advantages, but a single decision by the central government could halt an innovation throughout the realm. When Chinese rulers ended major ocean-going expeditions, no competing Chinese state continued them. Europe remained divided by mountains, peninsulas, islands, and separate core areas. A ruler who rejected an explorer or invention could not prevent a rival state from supporting it. Columbus approached several courts before Spain financed his voyage. Competition preserved multiple experiments. Diamond does not present fragmentation as universally beneficial. Europe's wars were destructive, and China's unity supported stability and large projects. The point is that political structure affected the persistence of innovation. Geography contributed to China's recurrent unity and Europe's chronic division. Europe also occupied the western end of Eurasian trade networks, while China functioned more like a large, semi-isolated world of its own. Historical explanation must also account for culture and individuals. Religions, institutions, leaders, and accidents shape outcomes. Diamond argues, however, that cultural differences often have earlier causes and can change rapidly. A complete account should identify recurring factors without pretending to predict every event. The natural sciences also study complex systems with unique histories, such as evolution, climate, and astronomy. Human history faces difficulties as a science. Researchers cannot rerun continents under controlled conditions, variables are interconnected, and evidence is incomplete. Yet comparative methods can provide natural experiments. Polynesian islands, different regions of the Americas, and large islands such as Madagascar and Japan permit comparisons among societies sharing some factors while differing in others. Statistical studies, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and ecology can test proposed relationships. Diamond is optimistic that history can become more explicitly comparative and scientific. The goal is not a deterministic law predicting a particular king or battle. It is to explain broad patterns, just as evolutionary biology explains patterns without predicting every mutation. Understanding why advantages arose and disappeared also warns against assuming permanent supremacy. The Fertile Crescent and China once led the world. Circumstances changed. Present wealth and power are historical outcomes, not proof of innate superiority or guarantees of future dominance. Diamond considers 4 additional classes of explanation beyond environment: cultural differences, individual leaders, political institutions, and historical accidents. He does not deny them. A religion can encourage or obstruct particular practices, and an unusually capable ruler can redirect a state, but those explanations become incomplete if they merely label the outcome. One must ask why a culture developed in that region, why an institution persisted, and why similar leaders had different opportunities in different societies. Europe's fragmentation provides an example of a factor whose effects changed over time. It delayed large-scale political coordination and produced destructive wars, yet it also prevented one ruler from ending all oceanic exploration or printing. China's unity supported early technical achievements and enormous public works, but later made policy reversals continent-wide. Neither unity nor fragmentation is inherently superior. Their consequences depend on the historical problem. Diamond proposes that historians use several methods associated with historical sciences: comparing many cases, examining natural experiments, reconstructing causal chains, and testing whether a proposed explanation predicts patterns not chosen in advance. The evidence will remain less controlled than laboratory physics, but geology and evolutionary biology also infer unique past events from surviving traces. Human history can be rigorous without becoming perfectly predictable. 2017 Afterword. Rich and poor countries in the light of guns, germs, and steel. In the Afterword, Diamond connects the book's argument to modern differences in national income. Economists often explain wealth through institutions: secure property rights, effective government, education, public health, functioning markets, and limits on corruption. Diamond accepts the importance of institutions, but asks why some countries acquired them earlier or made them more effective. Geography continues to influence modern income. Temperate countries in Africa and South America are generally richer than tropical countries on the same continents. Coastal countries tend to outperform landlocked ones because transport and trade are easier. Tropical disease burdens reduce health and productivity, while some soils and climates constrain agriculture. These patterns are not absolute, and bad government can waste geographic advantages, but they are too systematic to ignore. Institutions also have deep histories. Agriculture permitted dense populations, states, markets, writing, and administration. Countries with long experience of state government often possess institutional capacities that cannot be created instantly by adopting a constitution. Diamond cites research associating a longer history of agriculture and centralized states with higher current income or faster recent growth, even after controlling for other variables. This does not mean that poor countries are condemned by geography. Institutions, policy, technology, trade, and human choices matter greatly, nor does a favorable environment guarantee good government. Argentina and some resource-rich states illustrate how institutions can squander advantages. Diamond's claim is that institutions do not fall from the sky. They develop through historical processes, partly shaped by geography and food production. The Afterword therefore extends the original causal chain. Modern wealth depends immediately on policy and institutions, but those have antecedents in the long development of agriculture, states, disease environments, trade access, and connectivity. A map remains a useful starting point for understanding both ancient conquest and present inequality. The book's final synthesis is that human societies did not follow unequal paths because some peoples were born to rule and others to be ruled. They inherited different biological resources, continental structures, disease environments, and networks of exchange. Those differences accumulated through feedback. Food supported population, population supported specialists and states, states intensified production and conquest, and large connected societies accumulated more germs and technology. Once the resulting packages collided, they produced the dramatic inequalities associated with guns, germs, and steel. The modern comparison between tropical and temperate countries must be interpreted carefully. Diamond is not claiming that latitude alone fixes income. Singapore is tropical and rich, while some temperate countries are poor. The argument concerns average pressures, disease burden, agricultural productivity, navigable access to trade, and the inherited depth of state institutions. Technology can weaken those constraints, but doing so requires resources and administrative capacity that are themselves historically uneven. The institutional explanation and a geographic explanation are therefore complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Secure property rights may encourage investment, but maintaining courts and records requires a state able to train officials and enforce decisions. Public health can control tropical disease, but it requires taxation, science, and infrastructure. Geography helps explain why those capacities arose earlier in some places, while policy helps explain divergence among countries with similar environments. Diamond's framework remains a theory of broad distributions, not a forecast for individual nations. Countries can learn, borrow institutions, and use technology to overcome disadvantages, just as ancient societies borrowed crops and writing. The practical implication is that reform should account for history and local conditions, rather than assume that institutions can be transplanted without adaptation. A final implication concerns the difference between ultimate and proximate explanations. Saying that geography influenced the availability of crops does not eliminate the need to study Spanish strategy, Chinese institutions, African migrations, or Japanese politics. An ultimate explanation accounts for why the menu of possibilities differed. Proximate explanations account for which possibility was chosen and how it unfolded. The strongest historical account connects both levels rather than substituting one for the other. This distinction also prevents the argument from becoming a claim that societies remain permanently trapped by their original environments. Once crops, animals, technologies, and institutions can cross continents, inherited advantages may move. Europe received most of its founding crops from Southwest Asia, and many technologies from China and the Islamic world. The United States later inherited a European package on a continent that had not produced it independently. Geography shaped the creation and early spread of the package, but migration and diffusion changed who possessed it. Diamond's emphasis on broad patterns leaves unresolved questions. Scholars can disagree over the exact date of the first Americans, the independent origin of particular crops, the scale of Yayoi migration, or the relative importance of institutions and disease. Those disputes can modify individual links without removing the need to explain the overall pattern. A theory should be judged by whether it organizes evidence across many regions and generates comparisons that can be tested by archaeology, genetics, linguistics, ecology, and economic history. The moral conclusion is deliberately anti-racial. The modern distribution of power is not evidence that the winners were naturally more intelligent or industrious. Peoples who lacked steel or writing were often expert in technologies and knowledge suited to their own environments. When given access to foreign crops, animals, or tools, they frequently adopted them quickly. Historical inequality emerged from cumulative advantages and violent collisions, not from a hierarchy of human worth.